King Charles III believed the crown still gave him the final word over his brother's home and title. In 2026, that belief ran into something far more stubborn than royal preference. A 150-year lease Prince Edward had paid millions of pounds to secure, and a legal record that refused to bend. The documents did not bend to preference or institutional vision. They stood as they had been written and paid for. King Charles III had long worked from the premise that the sovereign possessed broad latitude to align family properties and titles with the demands of a smaller, more efficient monarchy. That premise encountered its clearest boundary when parliamentary and legal scrutiny in 2026 forced a direct confrontation with contracts and financial commitments made years earlier by his youngest brother. The documents did not bend to preference or institutional vision. They stood as they had been written and paid for. The Dukedom of Edinburgh reached Prince Edward in March 2023 as the fulfillment of a decision Queen Elizabeth II had made with deliberate care. She had watched her children navigate public life and had concluded that the title her husband had carried for more than 70 years belonged with the son who had remained steady, avoided scandal, and performed his duties without drawing the institution into controversy. King Charles carried out that wish. For Edward, who had held the title of Earl of Wessex since his wedding in 1999, the moment marked the end of a long wait. He had built a career in independent television production before moving more fully into royal work, always the sibling whose household drew the least attention and the least criticism. Bagshot Park entered the story not as an automatic inheritance but as the practical foundation for that title. The 120-room mansion, built in the late 19th century for the Duke of Connaught and later used by army chaplains, returned to the Crown Estate in 1996 in poor condition. Commercial proposals to convert it into a hotel or conference centre were considered and set aside. In March 1998, the Crown Estate granted Prince Edward a 50-year lease at an initial rent of £5,000 a year. The National Audit Office examined the transaction in detail. The house required major renovation. The final cost reached approximately £3 million. The Crown Estate contributed £1.6 million, partly offset by dilapidations payments from the previous occupants. Prince Edward covered the remainder, roughly £1.38 million, from resources he had earned himself. This was not a symbolic contribution. It was a substantial personal investment in the property that would become his family home. After the works were finished, the rent rose to £90,000 a year, a sum the National Audit Office recorded as market value at the time. Edward and Sophie made the house a lived-in family residence rather than a ceremonial shell. In 2007, Edward took a further step through his company, Eclipse Nominees Limited. He paid £5 million to extend the lease to 150 years. The arrangement moved to a peppercorn rent, a nominal annual sum that satisfied legal form while locking in long-term security. The lease permitted assignment under defined conditions, meaning the rights could be transferred in the future provided any new occupant could maintain the historic building. Recent public discussion has placed the estate's value in the region of £30 million. The structure Edward negotiated meant the Crown Estate could not readily recover the property for alternative commercial use without addressing the binding terms he had purchased the right to hold. The contrast with other royal arrangements became unavoidable once scrutiny intensified. Prince Andrew's occupancy of Royal Lodge had followed different terms, with lower effective costs to the occupant and less documented personal capital committed to improvements. Successive reports and investigations, including those published by The Times, drew the distinction clearly. When the Public Accounts Committee opened its inquiry into residential property arrangements for members of the royal family in late 2025, prompted primarily by questions over Royal Lodge, Bagshot Park fell under the same examination. The National Audit Office's subsequent review confirmed the arm's-length commercial character of the original lease with Edward. It also recorded that the Edinburgh household had, until 2020, generated income from permitted subletting of the stable block on the estate. The arrangement was never presented as an informal grace and favour gift. It rested on payments made, obligations met, and a long-term legal framework Edward had paid to secure. Inside the institution, the implications registered with quiet force. King Charles had consistently argued for a leaner monarchy in which resources could be directed more tightly toward current working requirements. The possibility that existing property arrangements might be reviewed to support that direction was consistent with the broader project. Yet the legal record on Bagshot Park showed that any adjustment would require confronting a contract Edward had deliberately strengthened. His representative's task during the period of review was to ensure that the history of personal investment, the commercially negotiated terms, and the extended lease duration were fully understood. The position that emerged was unambiguous in legal terms. The commitments entered into in 1998 and reinforced in 2007 could not be displaced by internal policy preference alone. What Edward held was not a revocable allocation but a durable interest that connected the dukedom in practice to the physical home his parents had intended for him. The personal dimension of the situation carries its own weight. Edward spent decades in the background of more visible royal stories. He and Sophie built their public identity on consistent service, on charity work, and on raising their children, Lady Louise and James, Viscount Severn, with a deliberate distance from constant media attention. When the dukedom arrived, it represented validation of that quieter path. Bagshot Park was the setting in which that family life had taken place. Personal items given by Queen Elizabeth II, including the Anthemian tiara created for Sophie's wedding from elements of Queen Victoria's collection, added another layer of private meaning. Such gifts were understood within the family as carrying the late Queen's direct intention. Any wider effort to centralize or reclassify assets would inevitably encounter these accumulated personal and documented legacies. Princess Anne's perspective on consistency within the family has always been direct. Having supported her mother through the final years after Prince Philip's death, she understood the practical importance of arrangements that had been made in good faith and backed by tangible commitment. The principle that documented agreements from one reign should not be lightly set aside under another is not abstract for her. It touches the credibility that allows the institution to function across generations. While private family exchanges remain private, the broader stance she has maintained publicly and privately has emphasized duty and the preservation of trust through reliable conduct rather than through the exercise of overriding power. By the conclusion of the National Audit Office examination and the Public Accounts Committee process in 2026, the essential terms of the Edinburgh household's position at Bagshot Park stood as they had been established. The title remained in place. The long lease Edward had extended and paid for remained in force. The narrative of a brother who had treated his residence as a responsibility requiring personal investment rather than an automatic entitlement gained clearer definition. King Charles, whose reign has required constant navigation between inherited tradition and necessary adaptation, encountered a concrete demonstration that some elements of family structure resist rapid realignment once prior legal and financial reality is engaged. What remains after the reports and the reviews is the quieter human record. Edward and Sophie did not receive a polished or prestigious residence. They accepted a property that had been allowed to deteriorate and restored it through their own resources and sustained attention. They did so while maintaining public duties that drew neither scandal nor extravagant cost. The dukedom now attached to Edward's name carries with it both the memory of Prince Philip and the practical security of a home that cannot be reassigned without substantial legal consequence. For James, who will one day hold the same title his grandfather carried for more than 70 years, the example set by his father is one of foresight exercised within the rules as they stood. The institution that confers titles and access to properties also operates inside a framework of contracts and precedents that even the sovereign must respect. These episodes expose the real texture of royal continuity. Queen Elizabeth II's decision to pass the Edinburgh title to her youngest son was an act of careful judgment about reliability and service. Edward's decision to bind himself financially and legally to Bagshot Park was an act of commitment to that judgment. When those choices met the pressures of a new reign and fresh external examination, the outcome was not reversal but confirmation that what had been earned and recorded would remain. The family continues to present public unity, as its role requires. Beneath that surface, the recognition persists that one brother's prudence created a measure of independence that institutional discussion alone could not easily remove. That recognition settles into the relationships that will shape the monarchy's next chapter, even when it never appears in official photographs or formal statements. It is the kind of adjustment that reveals itself over time, in the way future generations understand what can and cannot be altered by a single reign. It is the kind of adjustment that reveals itself over time, in the way future generations understand what can and cannot be altered by a single reign. The monarchy may present an image of unity to the world, but moments like these quietly redraw the lines of trust inside the family. What Edward secured was not just a house or a title. It was the right to keep what had been earned, documented, and promised. And sometimes, that is the most powerful inheritance of all. If you want more stories that go beyond the headlines and into the real documents, legal battles, and human emotions behind the British royal family, then subscribe to Palace Expedition. We bring you deeply researched, calm, and fact-based investigations every week. Hit the bell icon so you never miss a new upload, and tell me in the comments what you think. Was this really about property, or was it about something much deeper? Thank you for watching. See you in the next one.